This lecture, titled What Does It Take for a Revolution, is designed to introduce you to some of the basic theories and philosophies regarding revolution that are held by both historians and also some historical thinkers. We will use this lecture to frame really our entire unit over the American Revolution as we begin thinking about the definition of a revolution and what it really is, as well as the question of whether the American Revolution was truly revolutionary or not. So hopefully, with bookending the unit with this lecture on the front end, we will be able to better, by the end of the unit, ask the question, was the American Revolution truly revolutionary, and answer it using some of these theories. So as we begin this discussion, we'll look at a couple of the major definitions, or just general definitions of revolution, and then think about what it takes for a revolution. So as far as definitions, we can think about revolution historically as something that is either political or social in nature. And so when we're thinking about political revolution, we're usually talking about a radical change in the established authority, an overthrow of the established authority. And oftentimes we think of that as being a violent event. So we think of things like the Russian Revolution or the French Revolution, for example, both of which began with a monarchy in place and then saw the abolition of the monarchy by the end of the revolution. Although what was to come later is a point of discussion later in this lecture. When we think of social revolution, we usually think about a radical change in the social structure of a society or in some sort of hierarchy within the society oftentimes. And so often we measure a social revolution by changes in culture or in changes of institutions of culture. We talk about changes in social relations. And so if we're talking about, for example, the women's movement and the bringing about of the women's right to vote, women's suffrage, we could talk about changes in the social relationships between men and women and where women could participate politically. We could talk about the civil rights movement as being a sort of revolution when we look at a change in culture, a change in institutions like governments and how they give rights. We can also look at a change in ideology or a change in worldview. So this is where we get events like the agricultural revolution or the scientific revolution, where we see a change in how people kind of orient their thinking about the world. So we have all of these examples of types of revolutions, and we'll also talk about some non-examples of revolution, but these are some basic definitions that we can use when we're talking about revolution. Kind of the interesting part, though, is when you think about revolution, like the earth revolving around the sun, we think about a complete circle or a complete movement. When we think about revolution in a political or a social sense, we think about not ending up in the place where we began, and that's something else to think about as we get into this. So the next piece of this discussion is to look at the ingredients for revolution, or to think about what sorts of preconditions have to be there in order for revolution to occur. And again, we're talking about theories here, and so you have to examine these theories and evaluate them on their own terms, and then begin to evaluate events in history according to these theories. So there's a lot of just thinking and ideas that are going to come out in this lecture, and so you may or may not agree with all of them. But the first example, or the first person we turn to with some of these thoughts about ingredients or what is necessary for a revolution, is a man by the name of Alexis de Tocqueville. And Alexis de Tocqueville was a Frenchman who traveled to the United States in the 1830s and actually came to look at the prison system that was reforming in the United States, where people began looking at reformation of people, of bringing people back from committing crimes into society after a time in prison, rather than just executing people for their crimes. And so he was looking at a new prison system, and there's a really interesting story about the prisons he was looking at in the Panopticon, which was this circular prison. But that's neither here nor there. But Alexis de Tocqueville did come to the United States, and he observed all kinds of things, not just the prison system. And he went back to France and wrote a sort of two-part released book called Democracy in America. And it's a really interesting outsider's look at America, especially an outsider's look from a country like France that had also been through revolution in the half a century or so prior to his writing. And so he wrote in there that revolutions seem like they tend to happen in economically advancing societies, places where political reforms create an expectation of progress, that people are expecting things to progress and get better. They are economically advancing. And as societies reform and some parts of societies become more equitable, especially economically, people begin to expect that things will always get better. And then suddenly when things don't get better, that's when people begin to consider revolution or rebellion at the very least. This is something that a political scientist named James Davies, he worked at the University of Oregon in the 1950s. He designed the graph that you see, or the Davies J curve that you see on the screen. And so you can see on the y-axis he has satisfaction, and on the x-axis he has time. And you can see that expectations rise and rise and rise and rise and rise. As time goes on, people expect for life to get better. And then below that dotted expectations line, you see the reality line, where we see that reality oftentimes moves with that in economically advancing societies, but then at various points it will dip, and reality does not match the expectations of progress. And James Davies says that there's an acceptable gap that we are willing to tolerate, and then there's an unacceptable gap. And when things reach that point of unacceptable gap, this is when we see revolution in societies. So James Davies said something very similar, and this is very true in a historical sense. We expect that things are going to get better over time. Technology is going to improve. Salaries are going to improve. We're going to have better modes of transportation. In general, we expect for more leisure time as time goes on when we look at history. And we can see this also in more of a personal, just in the course of our lifetime kind of way when we think about families, and the fact that oftentimes the dream of a parent is for things to be better for their child than they were for the parent. So, for example, if you have a parent who was not able to attend college for financial reasons, oftentimes they hope for their child to be able to do so. So we see these kinds of things happening on a historical grand scale, but also on more of a minute scale as well. So the conclusion of all of this is that revolutions, in the theory of de Tocqueville and also James Davies, are fought not by the destitute, not by the people who don't expect for life necessarily to get better, but by the up and coming, by the economically mobile. And they're not necessarily revolutions for basic rights, because the people who are economically more mobile have those. They are revolutions for full participation in the economic possibilities of society, that people would experience the greatest economic gain possible for them. And so one example of this, if we were to think about it with the American Revolution, would be to think about the fact that after the American Revolution, Americans distrust elites. They distrust the people who are similar to the aristocracy of England, and they refuse to defer to them, and they fight to prove that they are better than anybody else through this competition. So it is these economically mobile people who are fighting. So this is one example of that. A second book that Alexis de Tocqueville wrote a little bit later in 1856 was called The Old Regime and the Revolution, and he wrote this about France, actually, and the France that evolved after the French Revolution. And in it, he says, okay, though the revolution does mark this impressive attempt to break from the autocratic government of Louis XVI, we see that the country eventually does come back to having an autocratic government again. And so he poses sort of this thought that if people are fighting a revolution truly for the sake of freedom, it might be successful. But if they are fighting a revolution for personal material gain, it won't ultimately succeed, and we'll see this return to the way things were before. So it's an interesting way to think about revolution in terms of what's motivating it and who participates in it. So this is one theory that you can use to evaluate the idea of revolution historically. Another work that is really important in considering revolution is one that you're probably familiar with, the Communist Manifesto, written by Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels. And this was written in 1849 in the midst of massive turmoil in Europe, both in Germany and in France. And so it's important to know that context. But when we look at Karl Marx and his thoughts about revolution and those of Friedrich Engels, we can talk about the fact that they believed that history is driven by materialism. And this is something that we talked about when we looked at How British Are You? That according to David Hackett Fischer, he doesn't believe history is driven by materialism. He believes it's driven by ideas and ways of doing things, but not by materialism. Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels very much believe that history is driven by materialism, and they believe that history evolves when you have these moments of class consciousness within different classes. And when a class understands that it is being exploited for the material gain of another class, they unite around a desire to fight for their common interests. And Karl Marx actually takes this back all the way historically to a period of what he calls primitive communism, where he says that we see the evolution out of that, where we start to see ownership for the first time. And so we start to see this ownership where you have an enslaver and an enslaved person. And he says that there is evolution out of that into a period where you have the feudal system. So you have feudal lords and feudal serfs. And he says that exists for a period of time. And then the serfs develop class consciousness and rise out of this. And we enter into a new phase where you have, instead of a feudal or aristocratic system, you now have a system of capitalism and free labor, where you have the proletariat and the bourgeoisie. So you have the working class and that managing class. And he says that this is where in 1849 most of the world was. But he says this was a historical evolution, not just a regional evolution, but something that happened over the course of time. And he says that when that proletariat rises up, because they develop a sense of class consciousness and of their own oppression, when they rise up against the bourgeoisie, they will finally bring history to a period of communism, where you won't see those class divisions or those class conflicts, but you will truly see a period in which there is common ownership of things, and that would be actually the point at which history ends. And interestingly, Karl Marx was taking the ideas of a man named George Hegel, who had a very similar thought about the evolution of history. And he thought that it wasn't so much economics that drove history forward, but conflicts and ideas. And he said that when two ideas met, a thesis and an antithesis, they would have a conflict. Historically, something would happen that would bring that antithesis into being a new thesis, in the same way that we take an oppressed lower class from being that oppressed lower class and bring them into being the class that actually has power. But he said that it was ideas that were in conflict that were moving us forward in history. And Hegel had a very Christian approach to it, believing that the end of the conflict ideas would come with the second coming of Christ, whereas Karl Marx very much did not believe that a Christian framework was the right one to understand society, and he believed that the perfection of all time and the perfection of history would not come with the second coming of Christ, but with the coming of communism. So this is Karl Marx's, maybe not so basic, but his idea. And in terms of revolution and the importance there, he believed that revolutions were not fought by the up and coming, they were fought by the alienated and the exploited and the oppressed. And he believed that they finally came together to protect their economic interests and their rights. And they're not really proving that they can be better than one another through competition, but they are rising as a class, actually, at that point. Marx and de Tocqueville were both participating in this debate that goes all the way back to Plato, the question of why does societal change occur? And it's a big question, and they both ask, what is the role of people in that? The big difference between the two is that Karl Marx is really looking at revolution at all times throughout history. He goes back as far as looking at the primitive communism and takes it all the way into the present day with capitalism, whereas de Tocqueville is really just looking at France and at the United States. So their perspective is a little bit different, but really they're looking at very similar things. Another theorist that's important to understand is a man that you may be familiar with from last year. His name is Clarence Crane Brinton. And Crane Brinton was a historian who worked out of Harvard. He was a historian of French history, and he both taught at Harvard but also had studied in Europe. So he had attended Oxford, and that's where he got his PhD. But he was an intellectual historian, and his most famous work is one from 1938 called The Anatomy of a Revolution. And in The Anatomy of a Revolution, Crane Brinton examines 3 different events in history that he calls revolutions. He looks at Russia, he looks at France, and he looks at England, and examines each of their revolutions and determines that there are a set of preconditions that always exist before revolutions occur, as well as particular stages that each revolution will go through. And so he examines how that's the case in each of those 3 places. He comes out at the end of his book examining these 3 places, finding these commonalities, but then arguing that the United States did not truly have a revolution, and that's something we'll talk a bit more about later. But in terms of his preconditions and the ways in which he sees causation, he is really examining what it takes for revolution at a very particular moment in history. 1938 is the year that Adolf Hitler was named Time Magazine's Man of the Year. The country was on the verge, the world was on the verge of World War II, and people were looking for cycles in history. They were trying to figure out, is there a science to history, and does history unfold in cycles? Does it always move, progressing towards some unforeseeable end, kind of the way that Marx and Hegel argued, or is it something else? And so, for example, the Russians were constantly looking at France to figure out who their Napoleon would be. So in the 20th century, there were a lot of people who believed in ceaseless progress, that was something that was inevitable, until Hitler, that made people question whether that was actually realistic. So he is asking these questions about revolution and about history and about cycles of history at a very key moment. So again, context is really important here. But the preconditions that he believes exist for a revolution consistently are going to include societal kind of conditions that are things that tend to lead to revolution. So things like an economically advancing society. He agreed with de Tocqueville and thought that when society is progressing, you're more likely to have discontent with expectations and reality not matching up. So the first precondition is an economically advancing society. The second is growing class consciousness and class antagonism. So he, in this case, agrees with Marx that that's a really important piece of having a society where revolution is likely to occur. He also believed that expectations for the future are not being met in a society that is ripe for revolution. He also believes that it's necessary to have an alienated intelligentsia. Basically, the scholars and the thinkers of a society have given up on their society and the way that it works. So he believes that's an important piece that's evidence that a revolution is likely to occur. The fifth thing he believed to be necessary were inept leaders, despotic leaders usually who were either self-doubting but uncompromising in dealing with society's needs, or potentially psychologically or politically inept in some way. The sixth condition he believed necessary was some sort of crisis moment. It could be financial, it could be economic. In that case, it could be a natural disaster, it could be a war, an assassination, but he believed there had to be some kind of crisis moment to set the country off into revolution. So those are the conditions he believed necessary for a revolution to occur. Then he believed that revolutions tended to go through 5 stages, and he believed these to be kind of a pendulum in the way that they swung. And so he believed that revolution usually begins in the middle with a sort of utopian beginning. It begins with moderate leaders with rhetoric about rights and attaining rights, but then he says that tends to occur but lead into a sort of uprising of the peasants, of the lower classes of society, some sort of climactic battle that takes society into the next stage of revolution. And so he gives examples like the storming of the Bastille as an example of this kind of climactic battle led by the peasants, where there is change that is obvious and is being felt by society. He says then the pendulum swings to the left, and he says that we start to see the rise of the radicals, who believe that the moderates were not fast enough with their attempts at progress, and there is an attempt to seize on the desperation of the masses at this point. And he believes during this rise of the radicals that there is going to be an attempt to purify the ideals of the revolution with some kind of mass participation or mass movement, and that these radicals are going to seek to level society, meaning bring everyone to the same level in terms of class, in the name of the masses. And so there are leaders that come into this. In the case of England, he cited that Oliver Cromwell was this leader. In the case of France, it was Robespierre. In the case of Russia, it was Lenin. So he says that a leader comes into the picture at this stage. Then he says that the pendulum swings all the way to the left, and we enter into the terror. And if you've studied the French Revolution, you know what that's probably referring to. This is when the radicals tried to purify the ideals of the revolution to the point of shedding blood. So in the case of France, this is where we see the mass use of the guillotine to eliminate the enemies of the revolutionaries. So in France, obviously, this went to the extreme of killing the king and his wife. But this is where we see an attempt to eliminate enemies entirely and an attempt to consolidate power for the radicals. After this incredible swing to the left, meaning the most radical place, we see the pendulum come back towards the center. And this is where we enter into a stage that he referred to as the thermidor. So this is when we see some control returning to the moderates or even the conservatives after that radical surge. And the moderates react to the excess of the terror and try to bring things back to a moderate place. And they reclaim the revolution for the middle classes. And then finally, the pendulum actually swings to the right and enters into the final stage, which is where we see one person take power in this place where the revolution has occurred. And it's not always a dictator, but it is a consolidation of the revolution around a few key elite figures. And in some cases, like that of France and that of Russia, we see that turn into a dictatorship. So we have Napoleon rise to power in France, and Lenin rises to power in Russia, and Cromwell in England. And so this is where we see a sort of cult of personality that occurs, and this is going to lead into what Crane Brinton believes is a sort of cycle of history where there are going to be the elimination of radical leaders and a central figure that maybe delivers on some of the goals of the revolution, but is going to build a new state on their kind of ideals. And so ultimately, Crane Brinton concludes that revolution is a process. It's not something that happens all at once. It goes through these stages. And he also cites that not much changes from before the revolution to after the revolution. And in making that claim, he is going to point out that the American Revolution is not truly a revolution, not because it doesn't begin and end in a similar place, because in many ways it does, with having elite leaders who just switch from being English to being American. But he makes the claim that the American Revolution in its origins was not a revolution for overthrowing or turning over society. There was not a goal of trying to completely change the social structure of American society, but rather it was an attempt to change who was in power. And so he claims from the very beginning that the origins of the American Revolution make it an event that is not actually revolutionary. So again, more food for thought, just some things to think about as we continue to examine or really begin to examine the American Revolution and think about whether it truly was revolutionary. The last kind of question or the last thoughts for this lecture have to do with this question of whether or not there are laws of history. If you take a chemistry class, you're going to study laws, or if you take physics, you study laws of motion and the law of gravity. In history, the question is begged, are there laws of history? Does history always behave in the same way? And when we talk about Marx, he obviously has an understanding that history will behave in a certain way because history is driven by materialism. Hegel, in the same way, believed that history was driven by ideas. But there are contradictions and ambiguities in society that are going to kind of draw all of those theories into question. And so the point isn't really that there is one that's correct, because there really is merit in all of them. As historians look for cause and look for effect and continuity and change. The one thing that we know for sure, despite this question of laws of history, is that the leaders in society make decisions based on a certain understanding of how things should operate. And right or wrong, those ideas or those theories have an impact, and they force cultural change. So we do know that this is ever present. But these models of understanding, Marx and de Tocqueville and Crane Brinton, are models. They're historical models for thought. They're kind of an intellectual toy that we use to look at different events in history and to examine the different factors that play into them. And so they're a way to begin to understand events in history. They allow us to draw easy comparisons. They allow us to make exclusions and to test historical questions. They aren't perfect, but they're an interesting way to think about history. And so as you see on the screen, as we go through this unit, you're going to constantly be reconsidering this question of whether the American Revolution actually does fit these descriptions and these models of what a revolution is. And so by the end of the unit, again, you will be asking the question and answering the question, was the American Revolution truly revolutionary?